Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right, I feel like I've been doing a little too many of these Trump, Ukraine, Russia videos recently, but this is Caspian Report, so last time. One more. Hope everyone's doing well. My name's Connor. If you're new, why Trump is selling out Ukraine for peace with Russia? Um, I have some opinion. I have some theories.
It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's
Kissinger
friend
quote.
is fatal. That was Henry Kissinger's brutal assessment of US foreign policy, and today, Ukraine is...
Yeah, I've heard this quote before. I'm not sure the context, if it was just a blank statement, or if it was in the context of something. I'm not sure, but I've heard this quote before.
Kissinger's brutal assessment of US foreign policy, and today, Ukraine is finding that out the hard way. Trump's U-turn on Ukraine has raised eyebrows in Europe and even in America itself. Once a vocal supporter of sending military aid to Kiev, he now seems eager to broker a deal with Moscow, one that would leave Ukraine in the lurch. Behind closed doors, Trump's team has allegedly offered the Russians substantial concessions, including Ukrainian territory, sanctions relief, rolling back US troops from Eastern Europe, and barring Ukraine from NATO membership.
Okay, all great things for Russia. Now, what are the Russian conceding points?
And while the negotiations are still ongoing, Russia has offered little in return. This sudden pivot begs the question, why is Trump giving up so much? What does he...
Oh, really nice grass, by the way. Yeah, I know that you have to look at this practically and saying, well, Russia keeping some Ukrainian territory, but Ukraine being fast-tracked into NATO, I can see as something that might make sense. But this just seems like you're giving Russia everything that they want.
This sudden pivot begs the question, why is Trump giving up so much? What does he see in a deal with Putin that makes it worth abandoning Ukraine, a country that once received unwavering bipartisan support? Is it a genuine strategic shift or just reckless deal-making? Well, to understand Trump's goals, we have to look at the bigger picture.
The one thing you never want to happen is you never want Russia and China uniting. Well, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that too.
That's Trump forecasting his approach in an interview from October 20.
I've learned a bit about Russia, China, or the Soviet Union and the Chinese. It's not as smooth a relationship as you might think. In fact, there's a lot of tension throughout the decades of the Cold War, just throughout the decades prior or post World War II. And so I think a lot of people might see Russia and China as a relationship with no baggage, but that's not the case. They have a lot of disagreements on things. And I think their alliance or partnership, whatever you want to call it right now, is more for their own individual strategic interests rather than a sort of joint interest, you know? What do I know? Let me know if you know more or disagree.
2024. The war in Ukraine has dragged on longer than many anticipated. It has taken a toll on US resources and focus. Trump and his security advisors see a need to shift priorities, believing that Washington should focus on containing China rather than engaging in endless conflicts in Eastern Europe. In many ways, Trump's policy toward Russia mirrors an old Cold War strategy designed by none other than Kissinger himself. The logic behind it is simple. If two of your enemies are close, pull one away. It worked in the 1970s when the US courted China to isolate the Soviet Union. Now, Trump looks to pull the same trick in reverse, flip Russia to contain China in the decades to come. Seen in this light, Ukraine has now become a pawn, set to be sacrificed on the grand chessboard. That's how it goes in geopolitics. Some align.
The problem with that is I don't know if Trump is thinking about that or if he's thinking about just scratching an itch, and you can't just leave that up to chance, because if Russia just gets everything they want here without some long-term strategic interest, even if you did have a long-term strategic interest in capitulating to Russia over Ukraine, doesn't mean it's okay, but it'd be less horrific than if you had no plan whatsoever, if that makes sense.
Alliances last only until a better deal comes along. Of course, Russia and China know perfectly well what Trump is trying to do. In anticipation, Beijing is now on a charm offensive of its own. It wants to strengthen coordination with Russia. It is hosting nuclear talks and holding joint naval drills while promoting Russian goods at home. Meanwhile, more Russian oil was imported into China than ever before, and trade between the two hit a new record high. But a lot of these events are also somewhat artificial. Take the story of China and Russia strengthening coordination in international affairs. It seems reasonably objective at first, but when you look at the ownership of the sources, 54% comes from government sources. So yeah, a lot of things are all happening at the same time. To keep track of things, I use Ground News. Its tools allow me to compare local and regional sources and form.
Fast forward if you want, guys, but if you're interested here, I'm going to watch through it, and if you're interested, you learned it from me watching Caspian Report's video, just make sure to use the promo codes and links from Caspian Report. It's only the right thing to do, and you'll probably get some perks. So links, original link, top description,
and
you'll find links over there.
I can't stress enough how important this is, which is why I asked Ground News to sponsor this video. I recommend checking out the Blind Spot page. They share lots of interesting stories that other news outlets often miss due to biased reporting. Go to ground.news/Caspian or scan the QR code on the screen to learn more. Subscribing through this link gets you 40% off the Vantage plan. Also, by subscribing, you're directly supporting my channel. Thank you, Ground News. The link is below. Details about Trump's peace plan for Ukraine are scarce. Both American and Russian diplomats have revealed little about the extent and reach of the negotiations. All we know with certainty is that the talks are taking place during the most dangerous phase of the Ukraine war. This requires some clarification. In November 2024, the Biden administration permitted Kyiv to use long-range missiles against targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory, including US-made ATACMS and UK-made Storm Shadow missiles. Ukraine has put these weapons to use, hitting targets in Bryansk and Kursk.
Wait, how can the USA speak for British weapons?
These attacks have the Kremlin on edge, not because of the damage they inflict, but because of America's disregard for Moscow's nuclear deterrent, something which the Russians have communicated many times over. Putin, for instance, has said that Ukrainian forces cannot use weapons like ATACMS and Storm Shadow without technical assistance from NATO personnel. And so, from the Russian viewpoint, when Ukraine uses these weapons, it's as if NATO itself is attacking Russia. While ATACMS have been used against targets in Crimea without much retaliation, hitting targets within Russia's mainland borders is a step up the escalation ladder. So, in response to what it sees as NATO aggression, the Kremlin published a new nuclear doctrine in November 2024, one that lowers the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. This new policy makes it easier for the Russians to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear countries like Ukraine. As a show of force, Russia then fired a nuclear-capable missile at a military base in Dnipro. The damage was relatively minor, so the missile probably had no payload and instead served as a demonstration of Russia's resolve.
It's like a message that, hey, this doesn't have a nuclear warhead on it, but I'm using it right here, and I could easily attach one.
Still later in February 2025,
A
the
bluff
Russians
charge.
used a drone with a high explosive warhead to hit the former Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine, which damaged its radiation shield, though there were no signs of radiation leaks. Regardless, these incidents show the growing nuclear risks and the necessity of negotiating a ceasefire. This is why Trump is in a rush to settle some sort of deal with Putin, a deal where Ukraine would surrender territory, resources, and sovereignty to Russia.
Without Jesus, sorry. Excuse me. This one right here. And what does NATO rollback mean? What does that mean, really? But this one right here, no NATO membership, it just means you're giving everything to Putin. Having Ukrainian parts of Ukrainian territory, sanctions relief in some areas, and then but the rest of Ukraine gets into NATO is, at least, I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with that, but there's at least some logic there that I can be like, okay, at least they're thinking of something. But to have that and no NATO membership just seems like you're capitulating.
In return, Trump hopes Putin will ally with him against a much bigger, more powerful adversary in the Far East. As calculated as it may seem, Trump's divide and conquer policy toward Russia and China stems from a flawed misreading of the past and a misunderstanding of the present. Kissinger's trilateral policy succeeded for two reasons. Firstly, by the time of his secret trip to China in 1971, Moscow and Beijing had already been bitter enemies for years, and China sought to improve relations with America as a counterweight to Soviet power. Secondly, at the time, Moscow wanted to patch up ties with Washington to reduce the pressure of both the arms race with America and its standoff with China. Fast forward to today, and the dynamics have changed. Neither of those past conditions exists now. Sure, Russia and China aren't ideological soulmates, but they are strategic partners. They share a mutual disdain for American hegemony and have found a way to work together based on shared interests.
If the enemy of my enemy thing.
And that's good enough. For added context, China steadily became Russia's largest economic partner following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Western sanctions that followed. The Ukraine war then cemented this relationship, as the United States and the European Union applied even harsher.
Guys, when it came to Crimea being annexed, I'm still learning a lot more about politics and geopolitics, international relations. And so back in 2014, 2015, I really knew nothing. Why wasn't there a reaction similar to Russia invading Ukraine in 2021 as with Crimea? Why wasn't... It almost seems like I'm learning about Russia invading Crimea after the invasion of the Russian invasion of the rest of Ukraine. Why wasn't the invasion of Crimea seen as just insane as the second invasion of Ukraine? Maybe there was outrage that I just didn't realize, but
relationship, as the United States and the European Union applied even harsher sanctions, Russia came to rely almost entirely on China. Trade between the two soared. In the last 2 years, for instance, Russia got about 40% of its imports from China and sent over 30% of its exports there. Military cooperation has also ramped up, with joint exercises and intelligence sharing mechanisms now firmly in place. The two complement one another's strategic shortcomings. Russia is an abundant source of natural resources and has provided China with cheap energy and technology transfers. Meanwhile, China is an industrial powerhouse and has offered enough economic backing to keep Russia afloat in its war against Ukraine. By combining their assets, Moscow and Beijing could well dominate Eurasia, which is precisely what America fears the most. conflict. Admittedly, Russia doesn't like playing second fiddle to Beijing, but it recognizes the economic lifeline that China provides, especially since it has been cut off from many global financial markets. What's more, as Beijing's power and influence continue to grow, Russia sees this as an opportunity to leverage its alliance to maintain geopolitical influence in a multipolar world. So, Russia's pivot toward China is not just a reaction to US policy, it's part of a broader realignment in the global order. Today, the partnership with China has become a strategic imperative for Russia, and its modern-day leaders see no alternative to it. Trump's objective to flip Russia isn't just theory, it's been floated before. During his first tenure, Kissinger reportedly encouraged Trump to improve relations with Moscow to counterbalance China's rise. But here's where reality sets in. The Ukraine war has made any American-Russian reset nearly impossible. The West has levied heavy sanctions on Moscow, and the Europeans see Russia as an
Sorry, what?
war has made any American-Russian reset nearly sets in Moscow to counterbalance China's rise. But here's where reality sets in. The Ukraine war has made any American-Russian reset nearly impossible. The West has levied heavy sanctions on Moscow, and the Europeans see Russia as an existential danger. So, if Trump wants to split Russia and China, he has to make Putin an offer that outweighs what she provides. And right now, that's a tall order. Beijing offers economic support, diplomatic backing.
Saying that's a tall order is insanely... I can't think of the right word right now. Saying that's a tall order in a vacuum is maybe okay, but it's a tall order also knowing that trying to pursue that objective of going towards Russia and of trying to make Russia more of an ally of you against China, or breaking ties between Russia and China, will threaten your current allies all over the place. And so in a vacuum, when I say in a vacuum, I mean the rest of the world does not exist. It is the USA, China, and Russia. Yes, it's a tall order. Now, we don't live in a vacuum. It is an impossible, it is a stupid order, because even attempting that, you're going to destroy ties with Europe. And so, I'm trying to think of an analogy. For some reason, I'm thinking of like rock climbing as an analogy. No, that's not good. Do you know what I mean?
And a growing tech sector that Russia desperately needs. This is not to say that the United States has nothing to offer, though. On the contrary,
it's like you have a group of friends and then you have two adversaries, okay? And you want one of those two adversaries to become more distant from the other adversary, right? But you pursuing that relationship with one of the adversaries could destroy your current friend group. So not only is it very difficult, you could jeopardize your current alliances.
Trump, not to say that the United States has nothing to offer, though. On the contrary, Trump's team is reportedly negotiating the withdrawal of American troops from NATO countries that joined after 1990, including Poland, Romania, the Baltics, and others. From the Russian point of view, NATO's eastward expansion at its doorstep is a threat to its survival, and the Kremlin would like nothing more than the exit of American troops. As of 2022, the United States has over 100,000 troops in Europe, with 10,500 troops stationed in Poland, 4,000 in Lithuania, 1,700 in Latvia, 2,200 in Estonia, 2,100 in Slovakia, 800 in Hungary, 3,300 in Romania, and 900 in Bulgaria. If Trump presses on with the withdrawal of US troops, it should be taken as an attempt to court Russia with the goal of containing China.
So in other words, other than Finland, the entire eastern flank of NATO.
However, relations between Washington and Moscow are at their lowest. Rolling back NATO's eastern flank may not be enough. This then explains the recent shutdown of US aid. You see, since the end of the Cold War, promoting democracy through US aid has been a staple of American foreign policy. Institutions and organizations backed by US aid have frequently and publicly criticized Russia and China for their lack of democracy, but the two have always resented this rhetoric as a violation of their sovereignty. So, by closing US aid, Trump is looking to make another concession to Russia. No more democracy promotion from now on, which means reducing US soft power in certain parts of the world. These two major concessions, degrading NATO's eastern flank
I'm a little confused about what was just said, but
and the shutdown of US aid are in addition to Trump's sacrifice of Ukrainian territory, resources, and sovereignty. So, what Trump is essentially negotiating is to redesign the global order.
this puts out a message that if you, going back to the Kissinger quote, I don't know if it's safer to be an enemy or an ally. I feel like both are pretty unsafe, which is depressing, but it sends a giant message that if you're an ally to the United States, you're an ally so much as you're until it benefits them not to be an ally. So what is the even point of being an ally if you're treated as someone as if you weren't an ally?
He's making room for the Russians so that they join the Americans to box in China. This framework is critical to understand. Otherwise, none of what Trump does will ever make sense. Even so, it's questionable whether the Russians will take the bait. Unlike the Cold War era, when ideological rifts created political divisions, today's world is shaped by economic interdependence. Sure, Russia will gladly accept concessions from the United States, but there is little reason to believe that the Russians would reciprocate in a meaningful way, let alone do a 180-degree turn and suddenly become hostile towards Beijing. China has proven itself to be an irreplaceable ally. Another point to consider is that even with Trump's back-to-back concessions, Putin knows that this will be Trump's final term. By contrast, Putin plans to stay in power well beyond 2029, but by then, a new US president could take over and cancel the deal with him. For the Kremlin, this makes any agreement with Trump feeble at best. Meanwhile,
that goes for both adversary and ally.
Relations with China are stable, predictable, and too valuable to replace. Framed this way, Trump's peace deal with Russia seems short-sighted and unlikely to work as he hopes. In fact, Trump is more likely to hurt American interests in the process.
Absolutely.
Concessions to Russia would come at the cost of alienating NATO allies, many of whom see Russia as a long-term threat.
So you're going in the attempt of maybe courting Russia away from China and definitely hurting relationships with current allies, and the fact that democracies, you change over time, right? You change leaderships and therefore international strategy means that it's like the risk is insanely high for the reward. The reward might be high too, but it's 1% to 99%.
If the talks with Putin fail, Trump will have lost more than he started with. His rhetoric will damage American soft power across the board and leave Ukrainians and NATO allies feeling betrayed. The toll for this gamble will be severe, so much so that the next president will have difficulty repairing those burnt bridges. In geopolitics, as in life, the worst sin is to destroy and betray yourself for nothing. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian.
Okay. So, forget about alliances right now. Alliances don't exist. Okay, forget about it right now. If you are a country, so I'll be the USA, and if you're a country that has your alliance is very positive to the USA, and therefore we're going to want to defend you in certain circumstances. And if you are not so important to the USA, we won't defend you as much. Now take alliances back in. How does you being an ally change any of that by the way Trump is acting right now? What does it change? So if you aren't an ally and you have strategic importance to us, we will defend you. And if you are an ally and you have strategic importance to us, we'll defend you. Vice versa. If you're not, we won't. If you're not, we won't. We'll throw you to the wolves. So what is the purpose of an alliance at all if that's the case? Why be in an alliance with the USA if you will be treated the exact same way as if you weren't in an alliance? What's the point? So,
report. Thank you for your time, and Saho.
Caspian Report, great channel. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. I'm sure you can tell I don't really know a lot what I'm talking about, but it's fascinating to me, and I'm trying to learn. So please call me out if you disagree, answer any of my questions. You guys are always great with that in the comments. Hopefully I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.